All right, what's going on, guys? Today we are going to be talking about relative motion and why it is important as a bodybuilder to understand this concept of relative motion versus orientation. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you've seen me talk about this. I've even addressed it kind of in some detail before, but I figured it'd be worth it to really dive in deep and give a bunch of examples of how you can kind of apply these concepts to your own workouts for each individual kind of body part. And so for those of you who aren't aware of what the terms relative motion or orientation strategies mean, I'll break it down for you real quick. So relative motion means that things on your body are moving interdependently of each other. So the pelvis is a really easy example of this. So let's just say I'm walking, okay? So when things move interdependent of each other, they move separate from each other, but they influence each other as they move, but they're not like moving as a unit. So if I'm just walking, that is kind of the normal gait pattern you would see. And there's a lot of relative motion happening. We have one leg going into ER as the other goes into IR, and we alternate that, a little sacral rotation. Now, orientation is when we don't have that separation, that interdependence, and now we're just dependent and everything moves as a unit. And so that can happen for a number of reasons in different circumstances. And in some circumstances, it can be totally good in what you want to happen, as I'll cover later. But in a lot of cases, it's leading to a kind of loss of movement variability, which can be pretty negative long term as far as like your joint health and mobility, but also on your physique, aesthetics, and hypertrophy, I believe. Another common example that's like a real well-known orientation pattern is what's called the butt wink. Everybody's seen the butt wink, right? So as you're squatting, you're going down, 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 and then you don't really have the internal rotation space getting deeper, and we just dump back into the posterior tilt and you get a butt wink happening. So depending on how deep you're going, we want this sacrum to tip down into what's called nutation and these hips to go into more internal rotation. And if you can't maintain that with the amount of force you're producing, you will have some sort of compensation strategy. It could be something to make like compensatory IR occur, like maybe your knees go in a little bit, or maybe you really shift really inside on your feet, or you could just have like that butt wink occur. And some other really common examples would be, say you're doing just a press and you're on a either standing overhead or you're like on an incline and you're kind of just thrusting your back and arching and flaring your ribs to help get that. That would be an orientation strategy. You might see somebody doing triceps and they really are kind of like rounding forward, or they're rowing and they're rounding forward. Those are all orientation strategies that are pretty easy to see, but there are some much more subtle ones that I'll cover in a little bit that can have a huge influence on where you're actually driving tension during an exercise. So in general, in a bodybuilding context, I would say orientation is not a favorable thing. Essentially, your body's going to orientate as much as it needs to accomplish the task that you're doing anyways. Whatever amount of force you're producing, you can try to keep as much relative motion as possible, but your body's going to do what it needs to do to get up. So it's really about being aware and not letting yourself orient more than necessary to perform the task if you want to really keep tension on the muscle. If you just want to move maximum weight, then that's when orientation is a valuable strategy for like a power lifter. Now, if we're talking in an athletic context, athletes are super fantastic at orienting themselves, and they have to be. It's how you produce the maximum amount of force, it's how you produce the maximum amount of stability, and you just can't do things with relative motion under the amount of force and load that most athletes do. So if we look at gymnasts, we can just see that they are orientation masters. This is not a relative motion thing. Everything is moving as a unit to be explosive and to have stability when you land. And again, look at this. Like again, a lot of people who are super flexible, they think they have like really good mobility, but a lot of times their joint mobility is kind of garbage, and they're just super hypermobile through their back and through a few areas that allow them to really orient into some funky positions that make them look like they've got just great general mobility. And a lot of times these athletes will have these compensatory maladaptations that occur over time, and this could be something like a shape change in the bone. It can actually become twisted. You can have ligaments become really lax. And these are things that are helping them better at their specific task, but it's going to have interference with anything else outside of that task a lot of times. So you might have like a pitcher, say, who's able to get like an extremely big overhead flexion move by getting tons of orientation in the rib cage, and they've had some adaptations that allow that to happen. And that's good because it's going to have them, throw a fastball efficiently. A lot of times sprinters, they'll have really like funky feet. It'll be pretty flat. A lot of times they walk with it slightly turned down, and that allows them to be in a position where they can orient really quickly to get in a position of maximum propulsion, where like someone else, they would have more relative motion occurring, which, like I showed you relative motion in the pelvis, it happens everywhere. It happens in the foot as well. So when you have like a normal gait pattern and everything's working right, whenever you step and you start to flatten your arch, you have relative motion occurring in your foot. That's dorsiflexion, that's forefoot inversion and rear foot eversion. A sprinter, they might skip all that and just orient to get those contact points to create max propulsion with less time between each step. So that would be really beneficial for them when they're sprinting max speed, but not really if they're doing other things, like they're just trying to go for a nice slow walk on the beach. So they're limited in certain ways because they're really, really kind of adapted and efficient at like one or two specific things. And so bodybuilders, we're not athletes. Our goal is to do something pretty unathletic, to build as much muscle as possible. In order to build as much muscle as possible, we need to keep as much tension on the target muscle as possible. And whenever you maintain relative motion, you get a lot more time under tension on every single rep on whatever you're trying to hit than if you let yourself go into these orientation strategies. And I cover a lot of different strategies for shoulders and pecs in the 2 videos I made about those. So make sure to check that out because I dive in pretty deep. I'll touch it here, but in those videos I demonstrated how the shape of your muscle and your aesthetics are like partly genetic, but they're largely determined by how efficient you are at actually loading those tissues and not letting certain compensatory mechanisms occur to take tension off that. Don't let compression techniques occur using the rib cage, which you guys know I talk about all the time. And I believe that's the reason why certain people have a really full round 3D look. And I think that's because they get full development over all the fibers. When you watch these guys work out, and I've shown you examples before, and I've got some more in the video, they don't work out in a way that uses a lot of compression orientation strategies. They use a lot of relative motion. They keep a good stack. They keep a lot of time under tension. They're not using really excessive ranges of motion because those requires a greater degree of orientation. All right, so let me show you an example of one of my clients who walks with major orientation strategies. They do not have the relative motion that I demonstrated earlier. And I'm going to try to explain how we try to build more movement capacity through improving relative motion in kind of like a rehab setting, and how that can actually translate to improving performance and aesthetics in the gym. All right, so this is my sweet lady Janice. I've been training for years now. If you watch her walk, she looks like a corgi. I mean, her whole entire pelvis shifts every single step she takes. So that is a lot of orientation strategies, and you can probably guess it, Janice has a lot of issues. Her main thing is back issues. She's got a lot of back pain, deals with sciatica. And when you have to use orientation strategies to produce the force required for whatever you're doing, in her case is just moving through space, managing gravity, your movement systems have become more rigid and limit options. For Janice, when she walks, pretty much her only option to get any kind of rotation in her pelvis is to move at her sacrum, move right above the pelvis to orient above it, and really keep a lot of tension on that low back with everything she does. So you can think of a parallel with this, as I showed you with the butt wink. As soon as you start to get that orientation with the butt wink, that's taking tension off your quads, and that's putting it through your low back as well. So orientation strategies, they kind of tend to funnel force through a really small area, and a lot of times that's not ideal. In fact, that's very rarely ever ideal. So when we're dealing with someone who's got pain, a lot of times the pain can be managed by just giving them more movement variability, giving them more areas to disperse the tension, the force that they experience in daily life. Now, as a bodybuilder, if you are limited because you orient and you have a lot of compressive strategies, maybe you're not really dealing with pain, but you're not going to have a full expression in your joints. You're going to be missing lines of tension when you're working out. And again, that's going to lead to a lack of that full 3D look, a full development. But it is also going to be way better for your mobility. You actually can improve your mobility during your workouts instead of destroying it in your workouts. So here's Body Omni Man just displaying some orientation with the pelvis on a safety bar squat. And to get more out of his quads, he would just want to stop right before that butt wink occurs. That's taking everything off the legs and is putting that on the low back. Now let's compare this with range of strength, who's using a lot more relative motion. And you can see just totally different. So our eyes can usually catch what is orientation versus what is relative motion, because the relative motion just looks better. It looks smoother. Now the way range of strength is doing it, he's getting much more tension on all of his legs, but especially his quads, and he's not putting his back in kind of a precarious position to take too much of the force, especially doing it over and over and over again over time. So for me personally, in my own workouts, I try to maximize relative motion and eliminate all orientation, all compression strategies. Because as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to be able to. Your body's going to do at least the bare minimum needed to accomplish the task. And what I've found over the last year that I've really been doing this, I get so sore. And it's because you're keeping tension on the target muscle, but it's also because you're getting true length and tension on it when you're not letting your body orient. So like my quads, they get so sore. They used to never get sore. They're sore all the time. My pecs always get so super sore. I feel my rear delts a lot. I feel my hamstrings, of course. So it's like every single workout I do, I get pretty sore. And I'm using like good weight, but it's probably 20% less than what I used to use when I wasn't as conscious. And I've always been pretty conscious of a stack. I just wasn't thinking about certain things to this degree, especially on the lower body stuff, which I'll mention in a second, because I think that is the biggest game changer for everybody in terms of getting quad size and also improving your whole lower body mobility and taking care of a lot of aches and pains that people get in their knees and things like that. Now, what surprised me the most as far as changes in my physique while I was doing this was actually my back. My quads got way more detailed. I really kind of thought they would. My pecs, they were always a strong point. I always pressed pretty correctly, even from the beginning. So I didn't expect to see a huge change in that. Same thing with my delts. My back, though, I kind of thought I might not get that kind of thick development, and I might not have the best back on stage because I made a real conscious effort to not orient, and that means not really extend at the spine, because really, like, if you're not aware, like full thoracic extension, that's just like a full inhale. That's like full extension, and a lot of people they go way overboard, and I kind of even avoided going to the full extension. So like all my pulls for the last year have been just like really down on the pad. I'm not coming off at all. I'm not really getting any kind of arch with my retraction at all. And I was worried that my back would not be thick enough or not be detailed enough, not look that good. But I really wanted to train my body to not work out in that extension, because I had always trained my back and always trained my legs in a state of just overextension. And I was really surprised. My back became one of my best body parts. So here is my last prep. If you look at this rear double, and I have some pretty ridiculous rhomboid development. And I think a lot of that is because of the way I pull without the extension. And even my lat spread is managed to be pretty thick. And I don't really I didn't do any deadlifts that prep at all. I haven't done deadlifts the last year or so. So I was able to get a good detailed back and thickness without any extension at all. And I was worried that might be a limiting factor. And if you look on stage, here I am right here. This is the guy that won the pro card. And it's like, my back looks a little different than everybody else's. And I think it's because I do that different than everybody else. And I have probably the most detailed one up there. I probably don't take the shot from the waist down because I'm not in, as shredded as this guy, but I definitely have one of the best backs up there, and it definitely looks different and more detailed. And that's because I'm lifting with real relative motion. A lot of people, when they train their back, they'll just go into a real big dorsal rostral compression. As soon as they row, they immediately squeeze back. They don't have a natural glenohumeral rhythm. They don't get any shoulder extension first, so they miss the kind of rear delt and lat recruitment before they get to the squeeze. And so I'm going to keep training this way for the foreseeable future because I don't see any downside. And biggest upside is that my joints and my body feel awesome. Like my knees feel so good. When you work out with relative motion and maintaining internal rotation for your lower body stuff, you actually improve your movement capacity by a lot. It's dramatic how much better everything feels. And so it's like I don't have to scale down intensity. I don't have to take any days off because I don't even feel my joints at all. So as I said, if you work out with a lot of compression and orientation, it just kind of changes your physique a little bit. I've used these examples across different videos before, but here's Stan Efferding, who was a powerlifter turned IFBB pro. Obviously, as a powerlifter, you have to orient to produce maximum force, but as a bodybuilder, it's not necessarily the best look, and you can just tell he's got that front to back compression, not really like a 3D popping look. You have good old Dr. Mike, who's super compressed, can't even pull any kind of a front lat spread. These people that really are super compressed, they won't be able to open up through that front lat at all because they are so compressed in that dorsal rostral area between their shoulder blades. And Paul Carter, who I've demonstrated before, has the worst lifting technique out of anybody out there giving advice. He's just so compressed the whole time, and you can orient like through a motion and use it to help you, or you can orient and just set up all shitty from the beginning to not give yourself a position to really get any good tension on your muscles. So they're both bad. And then I've used some examples of myself to kind of show you what someone looks like when they are not compressed, when they're not using a lot of orientation. They tend to have better separation, better fullness. I've shown you how this guy presses, which this guy's a freak. And I've also used my boy Nick as an example as well. A lot of times people will also start to orient when they are hitting failure. So for myself, whenever I'm training, as soon as I'm getting to the point where I can no longer maintain relative motion, and I could be using contact points on my feet to determine that. I could be using my rib cage. I'll get into it in a second. There's different ways to tell how much relative motion you're maintaining. And if I can't get any more reps without maintaining the amount of relative motion that I would like, then that's it, and I'm done. And for me, that's pretty much the point where I can't do anything even if I want. When I first started training this way and I would get close to failure, I could kind of orient to get a few more out, but like now it's like I fatigue the muscles so much. Like say I'm doing a chest press and I'm like really keeping my rib cage and I'm pressing like I talked about in my other video. When I try to get it up, if I'm getting like a failure, even if I kind of orient to get that up, like I don't have another one in me. When before I could kind of go ahead and get one more, maybe with a slightly more flared position. So I feel like it's been paying really good dividends in terms of muscle growth and mobility. So I'm going to keep doing it. I'll let you guys know if I change it up at all. All right, so just to sum it up, I personally try to actively avoid orientation strategies during any exercises that I'm doing, and that is because as you orient, you take tensions off the muscle, you put onto other structures, different joints. Connective tissue gets a lot more load-bearing capacity demand than whenever you're using relative motion. Other muscles get involved. So you don't fully develop the muscle, you don't keep time under tension on it, and you don't hit true length and tension on it if you orient. You miss that in-range length and tension. And perhaps the most important reason why you want to avoid using too many orientation strategies during your lift is because using those orientation and compression strategies, they will actually change the shape of your axial skeleton of your hips and your rib cage. And as the shape of your axial skeleton changes, it has a very big impact on all the peripheral structures. So think about your humeral head, your femoral head. As the pelvis starts to change its shape, say we're getting flattened out and we're getting more flared and dumped forward, now the femoral head has less room to move. It doesn't sit exactly where it should be, so it has less room to internally rotate. And then a lot of times the musculature on the backside gets really tight, and that limits the ability to externally rotate. So you get stuck in a position that's hard to get out of, and that really limits your options, and you're going to really stress out the same structures repeatedly if you use orientation strategies. Same thing with your humeral head. If your rib cage is really flared or shifted to one side, your humeral head won't be able to fully glide. You'll get bony blockages before you should, and that's going to change lines of tension that you can recruit, muscle fibers you can recruit. Also, based off the joint position and exoskeletal position, now your muscles can become concentrically oriented in certain cases, and that makes it really hard to get like length and range tension and to properly load them when you're trying to train them. So as I said, orientation is really only optimal when you're producing crazy high levels of force explosively, and you need to get your connective tissue involved, and this is much more of an athletic endeavor. We're trying to take as much tension off the connective tissue and other structures like our rib cage. We can just transfer force through compression of our rib cage a lot of times. We don't want to do that. We want to keep everything on the target muscle tissue. So let's go over some examples of what to be aware of and how to maintain a little more relative motion for each individual body part. All right, so you probably will be able to like just visually see and be aware of the more obvious examples I talked about, but let's go over some of the more subtle examples of orientation strategies that I try to be aware of with myself and with my clients. So let's start with some common things I see happen with legs. So we talked about the butt wink. That's a real common orientation you'll see when people are squatting, but something else that's really much more subtle could be something like this, and this could be a lunge, this could be a split squat, it could be Bulgarian, anything when you're in kind of a split stance. If you look at me, here I am at the bottom. Nothing looks super crazy, but I've oriented my pelvis into a hip hike on the left. So watch me adjust that. So that is where I should land. Okay, so check it out. It's real subtle, and a lot of times people aren't aware of this as they get heavier. So it just immediately adjusts, just barely, just a little bit. That's where I need to be to get the proper posterior glute mid fibers that I need. That's where I need to be able to actually properly drive internal rotation force into the ground. And making that change, you'll feel like a lot more butt than you would if you let that hip hike up a little bit. Feel more quad too, but definitely a lot more glute. Now here's another split stance example that's really common on people's right side, because in general, people are turned more to that side. I kind of cover this in the PRI and bodybuilding videos. If you haven't seen that, go ahead and check that out. So again, this is gonna be real subtle. So look at me at the bottom position. Okay, so anything look weird? I mean, it's not really crazy if you don't have a trained eye, but I'm overturning into that right side. I'm getting too much of a posterior glide on that. So instead of being there, what I need is to maybe orient a little bit before I even do the exercise. So what I need to do is kind of be aware of that tendency for this to really go drive back more through the heel, because most everyone's going to have better internal rotation on their right leg, unless you just get so turned that way, which does happen. But pretty much everyone will be more of an early stance position, of a early propulsive position on their right leg, meaning we're much more comfortable connecting to the heel and yielding with the musculature on the right leg. So basically that means we want to stay on the right leg more. We want to stay on it and stay back more relative to the left side, where we're more in a late propulsive state. We want to get off that left side. So we might actually be more biased towards like our knee going forward and our hip going through external rotation, which is the opposite of what's happening here on the right. So to counter that, you just got to be a little bit of aware and don't let your hips sink back into that pocket. Kind of keep it slightly forward. Let that knee go forward a little bit too. So that is a much better load. So again, real subtle. Let's look at it one more time. Overturning in that right side. And again, this will happen as you get more fatigued. I orient my pelvis a little bit because I'm already off a little bit. So you can orient to bring it neutral, and I'll cover a couple of examples of when that might be really beneficial in a little bit. Now on the right side, while you're more likely to kind of get sucked into that hip, on the left, you're kind of more likely to push away and turn into that external rotation. So on that side, you actually have to shift a little bit back. Think about feeling that inner heel contact a little bit more, because like I said, the left side, more than likely, you're going to be more in a late stance, in a late propulsive stance. So your body's going to want to shove everything forward. So just shift it back, whereas on the right, it's usually the opposite. And a lot of times if you're doing a bilateral movement, you'll see a little shift, usually towards where you have space. And that's something that you can take care of a lot of the times just by being aware of your foot contact. So when it comes to leg training, this is the single most important advice I can give you. And it's something that I've really just come to terms with over the last like 6 to 7 months. It's something I've been really practicing the last 3 or 4. And it has made a huge difference already in my quad detail and separation. And so I recommend you do this. On every single quad focused movement, I want you to be hyper aware of your foot contact position. We're gonna go all the way through the early propulsive phase of gait into the max propulsive phase of gait, through each kind of leg movement you're doing based off of the contact points of your feet. And when you do this, you will put so much more tension on your quads. It will be so painful, it'll make you want to quit. You'll have to drop the weight so much, but you'll really connect to your quads in a way you have not before. And also, you will fix so many issues in your body whenever you can really get your whole system to hone into this, because what's happening is essentially you're maintaining internal rotation throughout the whole portion of the lift. And a lot of times people orient because they can no longer produce internal rotation force equivalent to whatever they're trying to move. And so instead of producing real internal rotation, they'll have compensatory IR, which could be like the knees caving in, like I mentioned earlier, something like that. Or they're turned into an external rotated movement, and they'll just turn their weight on their outer parts of the feet more. And that is a real subtle orientation as well. I don't have the full femur pelvis that'll do that, but if I turn the weight on the outside of my feet, I'm gonna externally rotate the femur a little bit. These ilium are gonna externally rotate a little bit, and that's gonna take away the relative motion of the nutation. So it's gonna make it a lot more rigid system, and you'll be able to move the weight easier, but we're gonna take tension off the quads. You might get a little more glutes, and that could be a strategy if that's your goal. So I'm gonna walk you through this, and you wanna think about this on every single exercise you do. On a hack squat, on pendulum squats, on barbell squats, any bilateral leg move, even any single leg move, still think about this. So what we're gonna do in the very first part of the descent of our squat or whatever move you're doing, we really wanna connect to the heels. You need to feel the heels on both feet. And this is super important. Just really connecting to the heels will put you in the kind of torso position you need to be. You don't need to think about being really upright. You'll be probably a little more upright just because you are trying to really push through those heels initially. And that is going to kind of be the early phase of propulsion. That's where a lot of people don't have the ability to yield, because we're kind of all pushed forward. Most people are a little bit more late stance, a little bit more center of gravity forward in general. So by really focusing on starting the descent going through the heels, you can open up some of this lower musculature below your pelvis and really loosen that up, which can free up a lot of relative motion. All right, so we're gonna start dropping with the heels being the main focal point. Like right here, this is only, call it 30 degrees of hip flexion. I'm pretty much all through the heels. I have a very vertical shin angle. I'm on the inner part of the heel. You can kind of think about starting right in the middle of the heel and then going more to the inner as you start your descent. And as I continue to descend, I'm going to put a little bit more pressure on the first metatarsal head, that bone underneath the big toe. So I'm real heavy on the heel, real light on that, but you're always on there. You're never not on that first metatarsal head, even when you're lighter on in the beginning. And as you're going down, you're gonna shift equal amounts of weight between the inner heel and the first metatarsal head. And then at the very end, you want to start to connect to almost the flattening of the arch. You're going to be heavier on the first metatarsal head. At this point, maybe I'm like 60-40 on the metatarsal head than at the heel. And then once you have gotten all that you can as far as the knees coming forward over the toes without losing that contact point of the heel, then that is your in range of motion. So you're really heavy the inner foot back up. So I'm real heavy on the heel to start with, shifting to the inner heel, shifting to the inner heel first med head, shifting a little more first med head, flattening the arch. That is so painful on my quads, and I'm just doing body weight. So this is what I do with hack squats as well. So I'll give you some examples of what people do wrong, but this is super important. Try this on every single leg move you do, and you will notice a huge difference. This is also, like I said, it's going to improve internal rotation through your whole system because we're getting our pelvis to work with our femur, to work with our tibia, to work with our foot. So if you're feeling like a little stiff in your knee or anything, this can actually help a lot. All right, now here's an example of what a subtle difference it is when you're not really paying attention to the heel contacts. Say I was just doing like a max effort load and I wasn't thinking about it at all, just trying to move the weight, and I had this happen. It doesn't look too bad. You can see my knees are kind of flaring out a little bit. I'm getting a little tiny bit more excellent rotate, and then I almost collapse in a little bit at the bottom. Over time, you can see I'm already losing internal rotation. I'm not heavy on that inner foot. My quad does not have as much tension in this position. It's easier. And then again, at the bottom, I have the compensatory IR as the feet kind of fall in. And then I switch that up. Make sure I'm real straight on the inner point, tracking from the heel, first med head. Way better tension. That is internal rotation. So it can be real subtle. It could just be something like that. You could roll out just a little bit. Fight that. And for me in particular, my left leg will want to do that. My left leg will want to flare out more than my right. And that's pretty normal if you have any kind of AIC pattern. Another common orientation you might see on leg day, which I don't recommend, is overly tucking your butt. This could be like on a deadlift if you're really rounding under, scrunching under too much. Other real common orientations you see on leg day would be someone doing like a leg curl and getting tons of back extension while they're doing it, like a lying leg curl or a sitting leg curl. So to prevent that orientation, say you're on a seated leg curl, if you just kind of tuck your hips a little bit, don't scrunch your butt hard, but just pull your pelvis in a little bit, and then you do your sitting leg curl, you'll get way more upper posterior hamstring fibers, which is what we really want, especially if you have a pelvis that's pretty anteriorly tipped, and that'll help pull it back. So when it comes to chest, I made a whole video detailing all the most common mistakes that people make when training, and pretty much all of those are related to orientation and compression strategies. So real quick, a couple things that people do is sometimes they kind of bound up on a press, they'll kind of compress his rib cage, and then they explode open to kind of help them move the weight. That's really taking a lot of tension off the muscle. You're putting a lot of force through your actual rib cage through changing the shape of it. Another real common issue is you just see people start with a real extreme orientation of the rib cage, super flared, super compressed back, and just doing that, you don't really line your pecs up to be in a position to get really good tension on it. You're taking away a lot. Some people just have like an extreme amount of dorsal rostral compression between their shoulder blades, and as they press, they kind of like move a little bit with it. And that's a big orientation strategy as well. So in my video, I really cover everything that you want to be aware of to make sure that you don't have a lot of compression orientation strategies, specifically from the rib cage. But one thing I don't talk about in that video that can have a really big impact on whether you're using relative motion or not in your pressing and maintaining internal rotation during your pressing is the hand contact points. Talked about the foot contact points. Hand contact points are pretty much just as important, especially for pressing movements. So if you didn't know, the main area of contact where you want to have pressure coming through your hands into the bar is going to be this outer part of the palm and this kind of spot in between the thumb and the index finger. And there's a reason why like dumbbells and D handles and all of them are just a straight line. They fit perfect in that angle. So you never want to hold something like here across here. You always want to be angled right there, and you want to apply pressure at those contact points. That can help fix a lot of things that get wonky with the elbows or the shoulders too. As you do that, it kind of lines things up the same way that it gets your tibias and your femurs and your feet to line up. Does the same thing with your humerus, your forearms, and your hands and your wrists. It helps those all line up if you focus on those contact points. So if you're doing push-ups here and here, if you're doing barbell presses, any kind of machine press, anything like that, think about those contact points, and that will actually maintain more relative motion as well. Something that's really subtle. You won't notice it. It'll be like real subtle changes at the elbow. Shoulders, I also made a pretty in-depth video detailing all the common compensations you see with shoulders, and most of those are orientation strategies as well. So check that out. Like real common ones are the dorsal rostral area being too compressed. So as soon as you're lifting, your shoulder blades, they just want to immediately go together. They can't glide on the surface of the thoracic rib cage because it doesn't have its convex shape, and the scapula can't really glide on it the way it needs to. And also those muscles become concentrically oriented, as I talked about earlier. They don't want to let go. They don't want to yield. They don't want to go into like length and tension. So definitely check out that video to really go in depth with the shoulder stuff. Back. So I see a ton of people use a lot of orientation strategies with back, probably more than any besides maybe legs. And usually it involves trying to get more extension, thinking that's a good thing. But again, all the extension you really could ever need is that from an inhale. Anything else is just orienting and not really coming from the T-spine. So I mentioned it's pretty easy to see when someone's orienting in the sense that their shoulder girdle's rounding up, but it can be a little bit more subtle to see like on a row. So for example, if I'm on a seated row, I want to have relative motion occur, squeeze at the end. A lot of people will just orient right away, and they're losing a lot of tension on their rear delts, on their lats. Same thing with a pullover. You got to keep some intrathoracic, some intra-abdominal pressure. You can orient a little bit. That's not a bad thing if you want more of a stretch necessarily, but you can't lose your ribcage entirely. And so you can play with different varying degrees of orientation, as I'll talk about in a second, sometimes to get better leverage on specific areas. But most people, they end up just over-orienting when they do a pullover, and they actually going to lose a lot of tension on their lats. Now, if you think about your arms, the orientation strategies you'll see are pretty easy to see. Typically with a bicep, you might see someone do that roll forward with their shoulder, go to the whole ribcage, kind of orients all at once, really taking tension off. So that's really the main one you'll see with biceps. And then triceps, as I said before, typically it'll be someone kind of orienting to help a little bit at the end, or if you're doing a push down, losing tension on the way up, letting the whole ribcage and shoulders elevate instead of keeping tension and on the triceps. Of course, if you're doing a tricep press, and there's a lot more chance to orient, and you need to have even more space in between your shoulder blades to really get really good tension and maintain relative motion to focus on your triceps than even a press for your chest. So whereas like a press for my chest, I'm going to like really get depression and some low lat, low trap activation. For my triceps, I'm actually going to almost flare. I'm going to get lat activation, but not in the sense of driving down. I'm kind of like puffing out. I'm pushing my shoulder blades out to my side. So triceps would be kind of here, whereas chest would be more kind of right there. And so that's a lot harder to maintain relative motion from here. You want to retract really easily, but fight that if you're doing like a press for your triceps. Now, as a bodybuilder, or just in even a normal gym goer, are there any instances where we'd want to utilize orientation strategies for benefit? Well, in my opinion, there's really two cases where this would be okay or even optimal. One is if our whole goal is to build muscle, we want to pack on as much as we can. We're getting ready for a show. We have a show in 10 weeks. You're not going to be able to really do all the decompression techniques you need to be able to get the most relative motion possible, but we still want to keep as much tension on the target muscle. So let's take our pecs, for example. So let's say I'm somebody who's pretty compressed in that upper back area. So I have a hard time maintaining that intrathoracic pressure. As soon as I start to press, I want to retract and flare the rib cage. No matter what, once it gets heavy, that kind of immediately goes. Well, an orientation strategy you could do to keep more tension on the pecs would be to lift your head up. That's why so many people feel better lifting their head up when they're pressing, and that's because that's the only way they can create any kind of like space between their shoulder blades. They have to just move themselves forward through space by lifting up their head. Now, this isn't what I do, and I wouldn't say it's optimal, but if you want to get the most tension on your pecs at that exact moment, that might be the strategy to use. And so maybe use this while actively trying to get better at not having to do that, because That's just reinforcing layers of compensation. If you really do that over and over again and really load it super heavy, it's going to be hard to gain movement variability back. But short term, that might be what you need. You could also orient in a way that will like help you get more out of the negative, for example. So I talked about the triceps being a real common way to orient by just rolling the shoulders forward. Well, maybe you purposely do that. Say I'm doing some overheads and I'm getting close to failure, and I'm going to orient a little bit back, get my shoulders in a good position, and then control that negative just for a few extra, just to get a little more of that eccentric tension. That could be a strategy that you could implement. Just be aware of what you're doing. You could orient your body to give yourself less favorable leverage to get more tension out of a muscle. So for example, let's say my normal resting position is right here and I'm doing biceps. If I can depress that shoulder girdle, very slightly lean back, now I've got a lot more tension on my biceps, especially through the whole range of motion. It's not just really peaking in the middle and I'm not losing at the top. Now I'm able to get a little bit more extra out of the top, and it'll be a little bit harder. And I'm using an orientation strategy to direct the tension where I want to go. Your pecs, for example, they help to depress your rib cage. So if you orient up on like a decline press and then you focus on orienting down, that can actually be a good strategy to get a little bit extra out of your pecs and your pec minor, because they do have a role with bringing that down. The other time when using orientation strategies can actually be really beneficial is when you're orienting the opposite of what your body wants to do. For example, if I got somebody who's just really in this rolled forward position to elevate, and if I put them on that same overhead tricep and I just let them really pull that back and orient the whole shoulder girdle down, I have them work from there, that can be a good strategy to help them open up this anterior chest and breathing through there, because now these muscles aren't as concentrically oriented, because I've got weight actually orienting everything back in a position you couldn't achieve on your own. If I got a girl who's just got that flared out chest and that really dumped forward pelvis with the ass all popped up and arched back, I might have them do some pull throughs where they're scrunching their butt and closing their ribs down. Or if I had somebody who walked around in more of like a flat back, postally tilted position, I definitely wouldn't want them to do that. I might put them on a reverse hyper and have them orient the opposite way. Now this is the Camperini deadlift, and the whole purpose of this is to orient your pelvis. So this is a movement that I'm producing force through orientation. I'm trying to get everything to do the opposite of what it wants to do. I'm trying to get my right side of my ilium to come forward and my left side to go back. I'm trying to really get my left hamstring tie in, my left medial hamstrings to fire. And what this looks like on the pelvis model is I am just a little bit skewed right here, like most people are. And if you know anything about the left AIC pattern, or you've seen a lot of my videos, you've seen me present what this looks like. We have the right side of our pelvis is a little bit further back, the ilium's pushed back, left side's pushed forward, and so this is kind of the walk around position with the sacrum rotated to the right. The Camperini deadlift is shifting that and pushing that forward, so it's reorienting that pelvis. Now the way I'm doing it here is to reorient it more than to provide relative motion. There's a slight change that I can make after I reorient it that would get more relative motion, and I think I covered that in the PRI video. For this one, I'm going after orientation purposely. So there are some times when orientation could be favorable, but in general, you're going to benefit from trying to avoid as much orientation as possible and focus on maintaining relative motion as much as possible. And again, you're going to maintain relative motion by keeping intra-abdominal, intrathoracic pressure, keeping your head up, kind of looking at the horizon, keeping those feet contacts, the inner heel, first med head, the kind of transitioning from the heel to the med head to the flattening of the arch when you're doing the leg stuff, and those hand contacts on the pressing the outer palm and then in between the thumb and the index finger. All of those things are going to help you really maintain relative motion, and you will feel way different on your workouts. I definitely credit the way I train with helping me have pretty good separation and details on stage. I really think that this is one of the missing links in our industry that a lot of bodybuilders will benefit from in terms of muscle fullness and muscle separation. And then mainly, if probably the biggest benefit is reducing wear and tear and recovery time. Also, just so you guys are aware, if you weren't, I do have a membership available now on YouTube. I think it's like $5, $6, something like that. And with that, you get early access to videos. There's going to be some exclusive videos just for your members. I have a couple on there right now. And probably the most beneficial thing right now, bang for your buck, is I'm doing Q&As over there. I'm going to put some in video form when I get enough that seems like they would make a good video. But right now I'm just answering any questions you guys have, regardless, whatever it's about, biomechanics, anything. So you have direct access to me for like $5 or $6 a month right now. And I can't say I'll always be able to do that as there become more members, but right now you get the same access that people that pay $525 a month. I appreciate your guys' support as always. So give these a shot. Let me know what you think.